We finished our discussion of economic structuralism by talking about this idea of post-structural Marxism. And that included the idea that oftentimes ideas or what people believe are an important constraint or important factor in what happens. And in our conversation about constructivism, we're going to take that particular notion and we're going to broaden it out quite a bit, taking it beyond Marxism. So let's just begin with the question, what is social constructivism? It's an approach that focuses on the importance of social constructs and social construction. So you say, okay, what's a social construct? What's social construction? A social construct is an idea that's widely shared, that shapes how we believe and how we interact. And so just to focus on two parts of that, it's social because it's shared. And the fact that it's shared is really important. A social construct or a shared idea is not the same as something that I might believe by myself, right? There are some things we can do because we all believe in them. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. It's a construct because it is constructed. Human beings create these ways of doing things, agreed upon ways of behaving and interacting, expectations about how each other's going to act, but they could be different. And in places they are different. And so social constructivism is about how these ideas, these shared ideas form and how they then shape behavior and therefore explain outcomes. So let's talk about some examples. Chemical warfare in Syria. Several years ago, it emerged that Syria was using chemical weapons against its own people in the civil war there. And this was seen as outrageous. We might ask the question, why? Why does it matter whether you kill your enemies with chemicals rather than bullets? And I'm not going to explain the history of this idea right now, but what's important is that is what people believe, right? And actually it goes back to the period after World War I in which chemical weapons were widely used. So a set of ideas, of norms, and by norms we mean beliefs about how you should behave, developed. It says no matter what else happens, no matter if you're going to kill each other, you don't do it with chemical weapons. It's just too horrible. And I mentioned nuclear weapons. There are those who argue that there's a similar informal taboo against nuclear weapons. Those kinds of things matter only if people recognize them as groups, right? Because my confidence that you're not going to use chemical weapons is important in my understanding that I'm also not going to use chemical weapons. Another big example is the whole question of nations and nationalism. It's a very famous book written by a guy called Ben Anderson called Imagined Communities. And Anderson's argument essentially is that nations are imagined communities, meaning they are these identities as German or American or Canadian or anything else are constructed over time. They're not objective categories defined by blood or DNA, but rather they are essentially invented. And the reason he uses the word imagined in imagined communities is that if you consider yourself a member of a nation, you are considering yourself to be related to a vast number of people, right, that you are never conceivably going to meet, right? So this is not based in a relationship that we meet, we get to be friends, or we see each other, we work together. We are in community with people that we will never meet or see. And in that sense, it is imagined. And the process by which this happened, another author, Robin Ranger, has called the invention of tradition. So a great historical example of this is from the Italian nationalist Massimo d'Azeglio at the time of the Italian unification in the 19th century. He famously said, "We have made Italy, now we have to make Italians." And the point he was making was that it's one thing to have a state, but you can have a state without having a nation. And at that time, Italians spoke a vast number of different languages, and they considered themselves, or they defined themselves primarily in terms of their regions, not as Italians. And so there was a sense that there's a concrete process by which a group of disparate peoples get formed into a single nation. The same thing was happening, of course, in Germany at the time. So another famous book written by a UCLA professor called Peasants into Frenchmen. And it was essentially, again, about how people who formerly would have considered themselves residents of some village or farm or maybe a region eventually through processes of industrialization and modernization, consider themselves French first and foremost, right? Big point being that nations are contingent, they develop over time, we create them. Another example, is one of my favorite ones, and we'll talk about this more later in the quarter, is money, right? And I've sort of asked this facetious question. Why will somebody give me a cappuccino in return for a piece of paper with a dead president on it? Obviously, the cappuccino is worth more than a piece of paper with some weird symbols and a dead president's picture. Why do they do that? Because there's a broad mutual understanding, right? That we all accept that piece of paper is worth something and that we know what it's worth. It's not worth the value of the paper. It's worth $5 or whatever, right? It's worth a cup of coffee and a half, or just a cup of coffee if you get something fancy. As long as we all agree on this, it works, right? Money, the value of that piece of paper is completely imagined, but it's a powerful imagination because it gets people, of course, to give us cups of coffee and to give us things much more valuable than cups of coffee. But it's got to be a shared understanding, right? I can't walk in there with just any old piece of paper and get my cappuccino. It's got to be the kind of piece of paper that people mutually agree is going to be regarded by everybody as worth something. So this shared understanding or agreement is essential to this notion of the power of social constructs and social construction. So how does this relate to international politics? Well, constructivism in international politics studies the role that shared interests, shared identities, and shared norms play in international politics. And the key argument made by a variety of constructivist approaches is that much of what we want to understand cannot be explained without reference to factors that are socially constructed. That the material factors looked at by economic structuralism, by liberalism, by realism, just don't explain everything we want to know. We've got to look at these social constructs. And so we'll talk more about that down the road. So here's a simple question. Do you get it? Does this make sense to you? If not, you need to persist with this, because this is one of these concepts in this class that, again, applies well outside the field of international politics. It applies in a lot of sociology and anthropology and a lot of other disciplines as well. So it's a really big, broad, important concept.